Good afternoon, everybody. Great to see you back. While we were at lunch, Mr. Burhop asked me, well, are we going to get to the 20th century? And I felt like Dirty Harry confronting the police death squad in Magnum Force. I had to say, you've misunderstood me. Never was our intent. Here's another handout for people. You may have more than you want. You want to hand this back and let people, you want me to get you away from your computer. Unlike some of the others, this does have a page that, let's get the first two pages back to me. A page that sort of divides things up into its categories, and then the second page is the full bibliographical information. The theme of our talks are major events in the intellectual history of the West, where classical Christian education has played an important role. I haven't talked about I've only talked a little bit about the Renaissance, because no one doubts the centrality of the classics to the Renaissance. Talked a little bit more about the Reformation, where the true importance of classical Christian education within that movement is sometimes underplayed, just because there's so much to talk about with the Reformation. That aspect of it is sometimes ignored or at least minimized. There's a number of important works of recent scholarship that have been correcting that. In the case of the scientific revolution of the 16th and 17th century, as we've seen, the figures who created that were never in any doubt about the importance of the classical tradition in Christianity and the role of their education in setting them up to participate, although more recent figures, for reasons that have to do with the history of ideas in the 19th and 20th century, not always seeing that. And the movement I'd like to talk about now is our own American Revolution, the founding. The handout does note that there are a number of sources to the founding, our own experience here on the North American continent, what we've learned from that, the English common law that lay behind it, Protestant theology, which is extremely important, in which there are a couple of very interesting books on that topic, the classical tradition, which I'm going to privilege, the history of Whig politics in England, which can be viewed as a political movement by itself, though I, along with other people, like to look at it as classical republicanism, which makes it classical again, and then the people who work on the real practical politics, and we'll mention one or two of them in the course of my talk. And there's no question that all of these played a role in the founding of the United States. That is no country for old men. William Butler Yeats's line was chosen by Cormac McCarthy for the title of his best-selling novel that served as a basis for an Oscar-winning movie written and directed by the Coen brothers. There are commentators who seem to think it would be a good motto for the United States. Not just recently, I ought to say. In 1782, French immigrant Hector St. Jean de Crèvecoeur described Americans as rejecting the past and embracing novelty. In his Letters from an American Farmer, quotes, "What then is the American? This new man. He is an American who, leaving behind him all his ancient prejudices and manners, receives new ones from the new mode of life he has embraced, the new government he obeys, and the new rank he holds." De Crèvecoeur's vision is still alive and well at the conclusion of Dinesh D'Souza's What's So Great About America, published in 2002. Dinesh writes, quotes, "As the American founders knew," I regret there's no footnote to that expression. Anyhow, "as the American founders knew, America is a new kind of society that produces a new kind of human being. That human being, confident, self-reliant, tolerant, generous, future-oriented, is a vast improvement over the wretched, servile, fatalistic, and intolerant human being that traditional societies have always produced and that Islamic societies produce now," end quotes. I'd say something intolerant, but I'm too servile to disagree with him. And anyhow, what good would it do? We're fatalists. It's not only enthusiastic immigrants who think this way about Americans. John Andrews, past president of the Colorado Senate, that is former majority leader, wrote in his regular column for the Denver Post on June the 20th, 2008, quotes, "The old world is just that, old. Coloradans pride themselves on a state capital from the century before last. Our nephew in Bristol, England, showed us a cathedral from the millennium before last. He's a scholar studying what he calls the relatively recent Latin writings of St. Hildegard, who wrote 900 years ago. Europe's air is thick with the weight of the past," end quotes. John Andrews is quite correct. The Bristol Cathedral was begun more than 700 years before the Colorado state capitol. On the other hand, the medieval English Christians who constructed Bristol Cathedral over the centuries consistently did so in the latest style, at first Romanesque or Norman, and later, and for the most part, Gothic. The style 19th century Coloradans chose for their state capital was classical, modeled on ancient Roman buildings some 2,000 years old. I see your millennium, John, and raise you a millennium. By the way, I've said these words in front of John Andrews, so I'm not just speaking behind his back, though I would love to speak behind his back, but I'm not just doing that on this occasion. As Charles and Mary Beard wrote in their wonderful college text on American history, Rise of American Civilization, quotes, "It was with a mind fixed upon the imposing designs of ancient city planners that Major L'Enfant conceived his elaborate scheme for the city of Washington. When in 1808 the adopted son of Washington built his mansion at Arlington, Virginia, he seemed convinced that the final triumph of art lay in the achievements of Greeks some 2,000 years in their tombs. It was to the simplicity, solemnity, and power of Rome, the spoiler of Greece, that Jefferson turned for the design of his University of Virginia. In the same reverence for classical antiquity, the colonial Georgian style was now pushed aside by architects in the early Republic who built mansions for Southern planters, banks, offices for the federal government, and the Capitol to house the Congress of the United States," end quotes. In a word, the founders were traditionalists. This is one of the most fundamental differences between 17th and 18th century Whigs and the liberals who came from the Enlightenment tradition of anti-traditionalism. Enlightenment thinkers and activists understand their mission as freeing their generation from the dead hand of the past. Whigs, like our founders, saw the past as a source of beauty, freedom, and wisdom. What confuses some people is the fact that America's traditionalist founders in the second half of the 18th century were contemporaries of the radical philosophes of the French Enlightenment. Let me use as an example of what I'm talking about Thomas Jefferson, perhaps the most misunderstood of the founders. With the Declaration of Independence in 1776, states were faced with a host of constitutional issues. Edmund Pendleton of Virginia raised the issue of land tenure, allodial versus feudal, that is, whether farmers should own the land they work or farm the land as tenants of the state or large landholders. Jefferson wrote to Pendleton on August the 13th, 1776, about a month after the Declaration was approved, to say that he preferred private ownership of family farms. Those familiar with the bibliography on the Revolution will be confident they already know Jefferson's reasons because they've been told that the founders were heavily influenced by the Enlightenment philosophy of John Locke. Locke argued in his second treatise of government, chapter 5, on property, that the only rational and just basis of asserting property was mixing a man's labor with the fruits of nature. As he put it, quotes, "As much land as a man tills, plants, improves, cultivates, and can use the product of, so much is his property," end quotes. This is what Jefferson wrote to Pendleton, quotes, "Are we not the better for what we have hitherto abolished of the feudal system? Has not every restoration of the ancient Saxon laws had happy effect? Is it not better now that we return at once into that happy system of our ancestors, the wisest and most perfect ever yet devised by the wit of man, as it stood before the 8th century?" end quotes. Jefferson doesn't mention John Locke or any other 18th century author. He talks of restoring the land tenure system of the Anglo-Saxon ancestors, and he assumes this appeal will be found convincing. Jefferson first came to the attention of his fellow Virginians in 1774 by his essay we call A Summary View of the Rights of British North America. There he based his argument on the fact that the ancestors of British Americans had twice exercised what he called, quotes, a right which nature has given to all men, end quotes, to immigrate from one land to a new one. The colonists' position is often explained as a defense of their claims to the rights of Englishmen, and this argument is indeed important and even central in the arguments of, for example, John Adams and John Dickinson. In A Summary View, however, Jefferson stakes out a claim to the colonists' rights not only as Englishmen, but as Germans. Let me just quote a brief part of it. Quotes, our ancestors, before their immigration to America, were the free inhabitants of the British dominions in Europe, and possessed a right which nature has given to all men of departing from the country to which chance, not choice, has placed them, of going in quest of new habitations, and there establishing new societies, under such laws and regulations as to them shall seem most likely to promote public happiness. Their Saxon ancestors had under this universal law in like manner left their native wilds and woods in the north of Europe, had possessed themselves of the island of Britain, then less charged with inhabitants, and had established there that system of laws which has so long been the glory and protection of that country, nor was ever any claim of superiority or dependence asserted over them by that mother country from which they had migrated, and were such a claim made, it's believed that His Majesty's subjects in Great Britain have too firm a feeling of their rights derived to them from their ancestors to bow down their sovereignty of their state before such visionary pretensions. It's thought that no circumstance has occurred to distinguish materially the British from the Saxon immigration, end quotes. The German origin of English freedom was a common theme of Whig writers in the 17th and 18th century, appears in Montesquieu, an important French writer. It tickled the funny bone of Benjamin Franklin, who composed a bogus edict from the King of Prussia in 1773, which Frederick the Great of Prussia makes the same demands on the English that Parliament was making on the colonies. Very funny letter by Franklin describing listening to some Englishmen describe this document, which most of them took to be legitimate, and being outraged that the King of Prussia would make such claims upon them. And Franklin noted that one of the Englishmen was clever enough to have figured out that every single one of these claims were the demands that the British government was making of the American colonists. They suspected it was bogus, and indeed it was. The most notorious jokester among our founders. Jefferson, whom fine American historian Coleridge always refers to as the humorless Virginian, Jefferson took Franklin's idea, and it's also found in the Humanists and Montesquieu, quite seriously. On the 4th of July, 1776, the Continental Congress appointed Jefferson, Franklin, and Adams to a committee to bring in a device for a seal for the United States of America. Presumably they were chosen because some other work they'd done for the Congress had turned out well about that same time. And you know what happened on July the 4th, 1776. C.S. Lewis says, the reward for work well done is more work. Now that you've declared our independence, we need a seal. Jefferson's suggestion is reported by John Adams in a letter to his wife, Abigail. Quotes, Mr. Jefferson proposed the children of Israel in the wilderness led by a cloud by day and a pillar by night, and on the other side, Hengist and Horsa, the Saxon chiefs, from whom we claim the honor of being descended, and whose political principles and form of government we have assumed, end quotes. Jefferson's seal would have been devoted to two groups of settlers, the chosen people of the Bible and the colonists' German ancestors. As American historian, although French, Gilbert Chenard wrote, in 1776, quotes, Jefferson's great ambition was to promote a renaissance of Anglo-Saxon primitive institutions on the new continent, end quotes. This, by the way, was no youthful whim. Jefferson always insisted and was eventually successful in ensuring that Anglo-Saxon be taught as a regular subject at the University of Virginia. Go on and quote more from Chenard, quotes, this is the true foundation of Jefferson's political philosophy. No greater mistake could be made than to look for his sources in Locke, Montesquieu, or Rousseau. Jeffersonian democracy was born under the sign of Hengist and Horsa, not of the goddess Reason, end quotes. Jefferson shared his interest in the German role in creating Western civilization with Montesquieu, whom I mentioned, who was also not the first to discuss it. David Gless, in his delightful, although rather silly name, book, From Plato to NATO, has a good discussion, and the title is terrible, but the book is in fact quite good. Some people may think the opposite of my book. The title is good, but the content is good. See about that. It's probably better in today's world to have a good title, frankly. David Glesson from Plato to NATO writes, quotes, Montesquieu's idea that Western liberty was born in the forests of Germany began among the 15th century humanists who rediscovered Tacitus. The German humanists had a problem. Their only evidence for the ancient virtues of their race was a Roman author, Tacitus, end quotes. Gless misunderstands fundamentally the humanists and other early modern traditionalists. As Carl Richard saw in his wonderful book, The Founders and the Classics, to the founders there was but one worthy tradition, the tradition of liberty. Latin evidence for German virtue confirms the coherence of the ancient traditions. Because of academic specialization, we have people who study the Christian background of the founding, the classical background, the Germanic Republican background. But notice that for the founders, these were all traditions that worked together. Just as much as saying, well, in 21st century America, some people had a chemical view of science, and some had a physics view of science, and some had a biology view of science. In fact, scientists view that as all part of science, despite the very significant differences that, in fact, do exist, and also despite the considerable political debate on who's going to get the funding. Their self-image is that these are all part of science. The same thing is true for the founders. The different traditions that we study in separate books were viewed to them as tradition, and the fact that they overlapped and confirmed one another confirmed the validity of the tradition. Germanic traditionalism, which Jefferson certainly had, is quite consistent with classical republicanism, and Jefferson refers to both and depends on both. Let me give a famous example. When young Henry Lee in 1825 questioned the Declaration's originality in a letter to Jefferson, the old statesman responded by denying he was attempting to be original. The letter to Lee is from the 8th of May, 1825. He wrote back, quotes, "The Declaration was intended to be an expression of the American mind. All its authority rests, then, on the harmonizing sentiments of the day, whether expressed in conversation, in letters, printed essays, or in the elementary books of public right, as Aristotle, Cicero, Locke, Sidney, etc. This is not my personal opinion. This is an expression of the American mind. It is rooted in a tradition that goes back to the ancient world and includes the great Whig writers of the 17th and 18th century. Modern scholars refuse to credit Jefferson's explicit testimony. I don't see how he could be any clearer. Distinguished political theorist James R. Stoner of LSU writes, quotes, "The theoretical paragraph of the Declaration sketches a political doctrine that today we recognize as classically liberal, in contradistinction, I might add, despite Jefferson's claim, to Aristotle's teaching," end quotes. And after the fact, a popular textbook on historical method, James West Davidson and Mark Hamilton Lytle tell us, and their students, quotes, "Historians' reconstruction of Jefferson's intellectual world, imaginative as they are, must remain speculative. We don't have Jefferson's direct testimony of what he was thinking, apart from a few recollections made decades after the event," end quotes. Jefferson's recollections, as they call them, are confirmed by other colonial activists. Remember, he's writing about what influenced the people who voted for the draft of the Declaration. Jonathan Mayhew, a Puritan preacher, says in his 1766 sermon on the repeal of the Stamp Act, quotes, "Having been initiated in youth in the doctrines of civil liberty as they were taught by such men as Plato, Demosthenes, and Cicero, and other renowned persons among the ancients, and such as Sidney and Milton, Locke and Hoadley among the moderns, I liked them. They seemed rational," end quotes. 1775, 50 years before Jefferson's letter, John Adams wrote to a Tory opponent, quotes, "These are what are called revolution principles. They're the principles of Aristotle and Plato, of Livy and Cicero, of Sidney, Harrington, and Locke. the principles of nature and eternal reason, end quotes. Jefferson, Mayhew, and Adams share a common perspective, and one that goes back through the 17th century and back to the Reformation. Jefferson finds a right nature is given to all men, a universal law embodied in the actions of his German and English ancestors. Mayhew and Adams trace the doctrines of civil liberty, the principles of nature and eternal reason, back to classical antiquity. The colonists appealed to the rights of Englishmen, found in the common law. So it was a common appeal to tradition. Modern heirs of the Enlightenment find this language incomprehensible. If there are natural rights apprehended by reason, what additional authority can tradition confer upon them? Who needs tradition? The second question is probably easier to answer than the first, because the answer is the American founders. Once we accept the fact, or are willing to entertain the hypothesis, that their knowledge of and commitment to the doctrines of civil liberty were based on their knowledge of and commitment to ancient Greek, Roman, biblical, and German customs and thought, the founders' words and actions take on a very new, or perhaps I should say, a very old significance. Ignoring the traditionalism of the founders has led to serious misreadings of the Constitutional Convention of 1787. David Biederman writes in his recent book from Cambridge, Classical Foundations of the American Constitution, as follows, quotes, "It'd be easy to dismiss the influence of the classical tradition on the framing generation as some peculiar and pretentious residuum of the elite culture of the times. Indeed, in modern historiography of the intellectual life of the early republic, that is precisely the prevalent view. That classicism was mere window dressing to the pragmatic, hard-knuckled politics of the period. In the same fashion, these same historians have tended to discount the religious fervor of the times. We've thus managed to make a caricature of the framers and rendered them as we prefer to see them as ourselves today. In this version of the framing mythos, the individuals who act in our national nativity scene read only Enlightenment political tracts, speak only in a pragmatic political argot, think only in terms of class, money, and power. These are, after all, things we comprehend today. In accordance with this view, when the script of the framing morality play veers off into unexpected pieces of dialogue, when the framers speak of God's providence and the role of churches in the new society, or of classical models of government and republican virtues, our modern internal dramaturge excises the scenes or annotates them as irrelevant." End quotes. Let me exemplify Biederman's analysis by discussing the framers' deliberations on the issue of whether the state should be represented in Congress in proportion to their population, or whether each state should have an equal vote, as in the Articles of Confederation. Historians often treat this as the most important constitutional issue dividing the framers, one that was settled by a compromise based on practical politics. A standard version of this account is found in Max Farren's short book, Framing of the Constitution, which is all the more influential because Farren edited the standard 4-volume records of the Federal Convention of 1787. Professor Jack Rakove gives a more recent version in his Pulitzer Prize-winning book on the making of the Constitution, called Original Meanings. Rakove grants the role of tradition in the framing of the Constitution. Respect for tradition was part of what he called the larger world of ideas within which American constitutionalism took shape, a world expounded memorably in John Pocock's Machiavellian Moment. Traditionalism still influences readers of the Constitution, as Rakove says, quotes, "For the argument that later interpretations of the Constitution should seek either to conform to or restore its original meaning is a much diluted yet still recognizable version of Machiavelli's notion of ridurre ai principii." The Italian phrase Rakove cites, to restore to its original principles, is from Machiavelli's Discourses on Livy's First Decade, Book 3, Chapter 1, the title of which goes, "For a religion or a state to have a long life, it must often be restored to its first principles." This essay is often echoed by the founders. For example, George Mason's Virginia Declaration of Rights from 1776. Paragraph 23 reads, quotes, "No free government, or the blessings of liberty, can be preserved to any people, but by a firm adherence to justice, moderation, temperance, frugality, and virtue, and by frequent recurrence to fundamental principles." End quotes. Modern historians find it hard to take this traditionalism seriously. Most accounts of the Constitutional Convention treat the deliberations as covers for practical political politics. They said that, but what they meant was book after book. Rakoff's comment is, quotes, "The convention delegates of 1787 to 88 came to their task fresh not from research in their studies, but from the business of managing a revolution and conducting public affairs at every level of government, conscious as they were of the fate of other republics and confederacies, ancient and modern. The lessons of the past they weighed most heavily were drawn from their own experience," end quotes. And Rakoff's opinion there reflects, I would say, the majority of historians of the period. For Rakoff, the Constitutional Convention was the Madisonian moment, title of one of the chapters in his book. Quotes, "Madison went to Philadelphia convinced he'd found a complete remedy for the vices of the American political system on the basis of his practical political experience," end quotes. Madison's remedy was the so-called Virginia Plan, which moved representation from one state, one vote, as found in the Articles of Confederation, to one based on population. The Virginia Plan dominated debate in the convention's early months, from May to June, and provoked James Patterson's New Jersey Plan, which was a revision of the Articles of Confederation that was, after all, what the delegates were charged to do. Rakoff writes, "While it followed the Virginia Plan in proposing to establish 3 independent branches of government, it also preserved a unicameral Congress with each state having 1 vote," end quotes. The New Jersey Plan did not remedy what were widely felt to be the weaknesses of the Articles and rejected the delegates' vote in favor of a bicameral legislature, which was carried during the first week of the convention with the votes of all the states but Pennsylvania. Madison subjected the New Jersey Plan to a withering critique on June the 19th, and the Committee of the Whole rejected it by a vote of 7 states to 3, with 1 divided. As Rakoff wrote, quotes, "The opportunity that now beckoned the large state leaders was to convert this majority into a durable coalition in favor of proportional representation in both houses," end quotes. This they failed to do. And the question that faces historians of the Constitutional Convention is, why did they fail? The small states delegates moved to a position favoring proportional representation in one house, with the states maintaining an equal vote in the other house. At first they did not fare well, Rakoff writes, quotes, "Time after time they were battered in debate. As during the debate over the New Jersey Plan, Madison, Wilson, and King were content to take the opposing claims at face value and refute them on their merits," end quotes. The big states were winning. Then something happened. Let me summarize Jack Rakoff's summary. June the 28th, quotes from Rakoff, "After Luther Martin's 2-day defense of the immutable sovereignty of the states rambled to a halt," quotes, "Madison responded with a brilliant speech restating his theory of faction, which we today know from its appearance in the 10th Federalist. King and Wilson followed with arguments about the interests of citizens of states large and small. The spokesman for the small states declined to meet this argument on its own terms, as Rakoff noted. Benjamin Franklin rose to move the delegates begin each day with a prayer, asking the Father of Lights to illuminate our understanding. 2 days later, Madison delivered a speech arguing, quotes, that the states were divided into different interests, not by their difference of size, but principally from their having or not having slaves," end quotes. Quote is from Madison's own notes. The speech is a prophetic vision of the conflicts that would divide the Republic in the next century. But its ideas were not relevant to the current debate. As Rakoff saw, quotes, "If Madison were willing to inject a new source of division within the convention, it was probably because he sensed that the tide of debate was turning against him," quotes, or, I may say, had already turned against him. After a tie vote on July the 2nd, a new committee was appointed and moved a compromise. Each state would have an equal vote in the Senate, but bills of appropriation must originate in the lower house. For Rakoff, quotes, "The supporters of the equal state vote grew impervious to appeals for justice, however eloquent," end quotes. On July the 16th, the committee recommendation was approved, 5 states to 4. What happened between the massive rejection of the New Jersey Plan on June the 19th and the acceptance of an equal vote for the states on July the 16th? little less than a month. Given the frantic flurry of activity by Madison and his cohorts at the end of June, including two of Madison's most brilliant speeches, and Benjamin Franklin's pitiful plea for daily prayer, it seems likely it was something that occurred then. The disinterested statesman who rejected the New Jersey plan changed in 1 month to parochial partisans, impervious to appeals for justice, according to the standard narrative. I would suggest we modify the narrative and take seriously the idea they changed their minds because they'd been persuaded by arguments presented in a speech directly preceding the large state's outpouring of activity, which occurred, and here I quote Jack Rakove, quotes, after Luther Martin's 2-day defense of the immutable sovereignty of the states rambled to a halt, end quotes. Luther Martin spoke for 3 hours on June the 27th and continued on June the 28th, arguing for an equal vote for each state in the Senate. He avoided the issues of interest and faction, so dear to the heart of James Madison and modern historians, and concentrated on the principles of civil liberty as they were handed down from classical antiquity and formulated by Whig thinkers. His refusal to profit from the personal experience of the past decade that informed the Madisonian moment enraged James Madison, who threw his pen down and refused to record most of the speech. The evidence that its influence was decisive for the issue at hand is circumstantial but significant. Madison delivered 2 major speeches trying to refocus the discussion on interest politics. In the words of recent biographer of Martin, Bill Kaufman, Martin's 2-day stemwinder had struck a nerve. The response of Benjamin Franklin is quite revealing in this regard. Before rising to speak, he'd given Madison a copy of his remarks, which were far from extemporaneous. So in this case, we have 2 copies of the address. One Madison's notes, the other Franklin's own copy with his own punctuation. It begins, Mr. President, the small progress we've made after 4 or 5 weeks, close attendance and continual reasoning with each other, our different sentiments on almost every question, several of the last producing as many noes as ayes, is methinks a melancholy proof of the imperfection of human understanding. We indeed seem to feel our own want of political wisdom since we've been running about in search of it. We've gone back to ancient history for models of government and examined the different forms of those republics which, having been formed with the seeds of their own dissolution, now no longer exist. We viewed modern states all around Europe, but find none of their constitutions suitable to our circumstances. In this situation of this assembly, groping, as it were, in the dark to find political truth, and scarce able to distinguish it when presented to us, how has it happened, sir, that we have not hitherto once thought of humbly applying to the Father of lights to illuminate our understanding, end quotes. After some more pious reflections, Franklin moved the delegates to invite preachers to begin each day's deliberation with prayer. He was asking the delegates to ignore the principles of free institutions as handed down from antiquity and confirmed by British history and Whig theory in favor of their own lucubrations. For Benjamin Franklin, the Father of Lights had more to teach the delegates than the author of history, with whom he is sometimes confused. The delegates' response was significant. Madison's note quotes, Mr. Sherman seconded the motion. After several unsuccessful attempts for silently postponing the matter by adjourning, the adjournment was at length carried without any vote on the motion, end quotes. The power of the classical tradition led the framers to deny their most distinguished colleague the courtesy of a vote on his motion. This, however, is not the whole story. Although Madison's notes are usually the fullest, in this case, his disgust with Luther Martin led him to ignore an important point preserved in the laconic jottings of Martin's ally, William Patterson of New Jersey. Very brief quotes. Amphictyonic Council of Greece, represented by 2 from each town, who were, notwithstanding the disproportion of the towns, equal. Rollin's Ancient History, Volume 4, page 79, end quotes. Gilbert Chenard wrote, quotes, who would have thought, unless such positive texts were produced, that the limitation of 2 senators for each state might perhaps be traced to the Amphictyonic Council of Greece, end quotes. Rather, I would say, who can deny that the documentary record proves that the Amphictyonic League provided the precedent for the idea of 2 senators from each state. Who can fail to be impressed this happened in the face of vigorous opposition of James Madison and the weary protests of Benjamin Franklin? Luther Martin not only won the delegates over to preserving an equal vote for each state, they even kept a suggestion for the number of senators, because it came with a classical precedent. The standard narrative cannot explain the mystery of why the impartial statesmen who rejected the New Jersey plan on June the 19th metamorphosed into the selfish partisans who approved an equal vote Senate on July the 16th. In the traditionalist narrative, the framers were not impervious to the appeals of justice. They were sensitive to the rooted wisdom of the classical tradition. The influence of tradition came to the fore again a month later in the middle of August. Wilson and Madison tried to modify the July 16 vote by moving the bills of appropriation be allowed to originate in either house. Their forceful speeches argued there was no logical reason to restrict originating such bills to only one house, since both houses had to approve the bill in any case. In addition, the lower houses of state legislatures had often behaved irresponsibly over the past decade. The motion was soundly defeated. Historians of the convention rarely even mention it. For a traditionalist history of the convention, it's important because of the response it provoked from John Dickinson, who expressed clearly and explicitly the fundamental principles that guided most delegates during the convention. Dickinson's response to this proposal of Wilson and Madison, quotes, "Experience must be our only guide. Reason may lead us astray. It was not reason that discovered the singular and admirable mechanism of the English Constitution. It was not reason that discovered or ever could have discovered the odd, and in the eyes of those who are governed by reason, the absurd mode of trial by jury. Accidents probably produce these discoveries, and experience has given a sanction to them. This is then our guide. And has not experience verified the utility of restraining money bills to the immediate representatives of the people? Whence the effect may have proceeded, he could not say, whether from the respect with which this privilege inspired the other branches of government to the House of Commons, or from the turn of thinking it gave to the people at large with regard to their rights. But the effect was visible and could not be doubted. Shall we oppose to this long historical experience the short experience of 11 years, which we had ourselves on this subject?" End quotes. Dickinson's rhetorical question is a direct challenge to Madison and a prophetic challenge to Jack Raycove's analysis in 1996. Remember what Raycove wrote, quote, "Conscious as they were of the fate of other republics and confederacies, ancient and modern, the lessons of the past they weighed most heavily were drawn from their own experience." End quotes. The vote on this otherwise unimportant issue shows clearly that almost the opposite was true. What weighed most heavily with the delegates in Philadelphia during the summer of 1787 was not the short experience of 11 years, which we have had ourselves, but which is, by the way, what we mean today by the word experience. That's what we mean by experience. No, what mattered most to them was tradition. Experience for John Dickinson and the majority of the delegates who voted with him on this matter and many others meant first and foremost history and tradition, and Dickinson opposed it directly to an ahistorical rationalism. "Experience must be our only guide," he said. Mel Bradford's fine book on the Constitution, called A Better Guide Than Reason, actually compromises it. Dickinson didn't say that tradition was a better guide than reason. He said experience must be our only guide. Reason may lead us astray. And he won the vote. The story of the Philadelphia Convention and American history in general needs to be rewritten to show Americans time and again privileging biblical, classical, German, and English traditions over an anti-traditionalist Enlightenment rationalism. Because traditionalists respect the variety found in different traditions, our rationalist opponents often charge us with relativism and refuse to believe that those who value principles as firmly as the founders could be traditionalists. Yet traditionalists believe in moral truth. In one of the great classics of traditionalism, The Abolition of Man, C.S. Lewis reviews the consistent assertion of the moral law given by the great traditions all over the world and throughout history. The duties that structure our lives will usually be determined by what English philosopher F.H. Bradley called my station and its duties. But that memorable statement of traditionalist ethics is followed by a chapter on ideal ethics. Traditionalists believe in the existence of fundamental moral principles that can be grasped by reason and are valid without exception. Each person, however, learns of these principles from tradition in the context of family and community. Otherwise, reason's later grasp of their exceptionalist validity is stillborn. The Enlightenment privileged individuals and their natural rights over tradition, family, and duty. As we face the fruits of this experiment, we may decide that Mr. Jefferson was right. Is it not better now that we return at once into that happy system of our ancestors? It was a system where members of families and communities learn their concrete duties and fundamental principles from religious and secular traditions. The delegates and the other educated founders learned these principles at home and at school. The classical Christian curriculum of colonial America has been the subject of careful and thorough research, which I have on the handout. The search for classical sources in interpreting the founding does not presuppose that 18th century Americans possessed a scholarly command of the extant sources for the ancient world. On the contrary, the use of the ancient classics in colonial school curriculum was based on a select number of texts which were carefully and painstakingly parsed, read, and translated. Learning Latin grammar was the first step in acquiring the arts of language of the trivium. Grammar, Latin grammar, dialectic or logic, and rhetoric. The choice of text was influenced by college entrance examinations, which emphasized Virgil and Tully, that is Cicero, in the entrance exams and the courses taught. Colonial Americans did not study these texts like modern candidates for a PhD in what we now call classics. Indeed, they didn't possess the scholarly understanding of ancient texts possessed by European scholars, like Richard Bentley, who I mentioned earlier, or Joseph Scaliger, or Isaac Casaubon. They studied the texts like schoolboys who wanted to satisfy their teachers and get into college. But they remembered them after graduation, and they used them to interpret political and ethical issues. Americans wanted to live and work in classical buildings, as I said at the beginning, because their tastes were formed by the classical education. George Washington was unusual among the founders in not receiving a classical education, but in his public life, he surrounded himself with men who did, and in his private life, he made sure that his stepson, Jack Custis, studied and loved the classics. We owe the best praise of America's old classical education to historian Clinton Rossiter in his book, Seed Time of the Republic. Goes back to 1953. Although Rossiter also wrote, quotes, the Americans would have believed just as vigorously in public morality had Cato and the Gracchi never lived, end quotes, he knew the importance of their education to their ideals and accomplishments. Here's from Seed Time of the Republic, quotes, it's easy to smile at the dull, rigid, crabbed methods that prevail in colonial colleges. But if we judge the vineyards by the fruit they brought forth, we must acknowledge that a fertile ground of learning, science, reason, and liberty. They may not have taught young men enough useful knowledge, but they did teach them, in their own tradition-ridden way, to think, communicate, and lead. The classical education taught our founders to think, communicate, and lead. And Rossiter goes on, the roll call of Harvard and William and Mary men in the Revolution should be evidence enough that Latin, logic, and metaphysics were a rich fertilizer in the cultivation of reason, virtue, honor, and the love of liberty. End quotes. And by the way, it was not just the colonial period. 2008, David J. Biederman published The Classical Foundations of the American Constitution, showing that it continued. 2002, Carolyn Winter of Stanford showed the classical education was the educational gold standard throughout the 19th century in her book, Culture of Classicism. In 2009, Carl Richard, author of the standard book on the founders and the classics, published Golden Age of Classics in America and showed how the classics permeated the rambunctious creativity and politics of 19th century America. After the Civil War, Richard argues, and here I quote Carl, The classics began a gradual decline due to social, economic, and intellectual forces, end quotes. I believe the decline was very gradual until the cultural catastrophe of the 1960s. Episcopalian prep schools, Lutheran and Catholic parochial schools continued to teach Latin. According to statistics compiled by the United States Office of Education, in the school year 1889 to 90, the first year they compiled the statistics, 34.7% of public high school students took Latin. In 1900 and 1910, one half of public high school students were enrolled in Latin. Percentages were even higher in private and parochial schools. As recently as 1962, 728,637 students were enrolled in high school Latin in public high schools. The founders knew that the wisdom, freedom, and beauty in our world are a legacy from the past, and that legacy is essential for future freedom and creativity. They knew this, as did the great creative figures of the Renaissance, the Reformation, and the Scientific Revolution. John Adams wrote to his friend, the patriot Dr. Benjamin Rush, quotes, "I should as soon think of closing all my window shutters to enable me to see as of banishing the classics to improve Republican ideals." Quotes, classical Christian education created the modern world, as the founders were well aware. When Lutheran pastor Frederick Christian Schaeffer sent James Madison a copy of the address he delivered at the founding of St. Matthew's Church in New York City, and by the way, that congregation is still in existence, not in the same church building, and is a member of the Lutheran Church Missouri Synod, Madison responded to Schaeffer from his retirement in Montpelier, Virginia, on December the 3rd, 1821. He wrote, quotes, Your address illustrates the excellence of a system which by a due distinction, to which the genius and courage of Luther led the way, between what is due to Caesar and what is due God. This system best promotes the discharge of both obligations, end quotes. Today, as 200 years ago, we need to keep our window shutters open by a curriculum that preserves and unites our religious and cultural traditions. Thank you for your kind attention. Comments, questions, outraged objections? Yes, please.
Sorry, I'm getting predictable. I don't mean to make this a peanut gallery by sitting here. They're really good people, actually.
I know they really have been the... I see them trying to hold your hand down, and you're just too strong for them.
When we talk about the founding generation and their classicism, or well, let's just say when we talk about the founders and their traditionalism, I guess the question I've wrestled with is, how monolithic are they? I mean, when we talk about the founding sort of being oriented one way towards this, I mean, because I think a compelling case can be made that Jefferson, his later parts of his legacy proof, was kind of more of a French, more akin to the French philosophes than the English Enlightenment. And, traditionalism in some ways didn't necessarily carry over in other ways. Let me try to put a cap on this so it doesn't just meander. But it seems difficult to, to say that the classicism of the founders, tended to comport perfectly with this Christian understanding of the state of America that we later covered. I guess what I've been bothered by is maybe as a Lutheran trying to vindicate things that are very, very much sort of hallmarks of English Protestantism and with a Lutheran Christian understanding. Maybe that ended up a different place than it started, but they were at least connected in my mind at some point. Maybe you can help me with that.
Good. So I'm going to take advantage of my position here to sort of interpret your questions. So if I see you waving your arms furiously, like a J. Alfred Prufrock, that's not what I meant. That's not what I meant at all. But there's the issue of Jefferson, which I confronted directly, rather than quote all the great quotations from John Adams, and I did quote Dickinson. You know, there are these standard traditionalist Christian conservatives that you can quote over and over again, and no one really doubts it. Jefferson is the one who is, in my opinion, most thoroughly misrepresented as a French philosophe. He did go over and was our second ambassador to France during the time of the Revolution. He could read French fluently and didn't speak it very well at all. So he was very much stuck talking to Lafayette, who was full of these ideas that it was all going to be like the American Revolution, and there was going to be a constitutional monarchy, and it was all going to end very well, and somewhere along the line that didn't happen. And it took Jefferson a long time to figure this out. My own explanation for that, by the way, is that it was because he was there. He actually witnessed what was going on. John Adams and Edmund Burke, who weren't there, correctly interpreted what was going to happen to the French Revolution because they'd read their classical texts on the decline of free governments, and they could see it happening. And it's one of these wonderful situations where knowing the correct theory based on thousands of years of historical tradition let them see, whereas Jefferson, who was surrounded by it all, was to some extent genuinely confused by what was going on. For the most part, however, Jefferson's views were those of traditionalists. He was very classically oriented. I just quoted one or two, especially the letter to Lee, but letter after letter about the importance of classical education, its centrality, also notes on the state of Virginia. I hear that in Europe they are giving up on classical education. I know not what their manners and morals make hold for, but it would be very unwise in us to follow them in this. And there are a whole bunch of these similar quotations, because there were a few people like Tom Paine and Benjamin Rush explicitly, and Benjamin Franklin in a more crypto fashion, attempting to sabotage classical education. And it was a complete failure. They had almost no influence. Same thing happened in the 19th century. It's in both Carolyn Winter's Culture of Classicism and Carl Richard's new Golden Age of Classics in America, which just came out 2 years ago from Harvard, showing that the objections were overwhelmed. They really got nowhere until the middle of the 20th century, quite frankly. So there were many different influences on the founding. Some of them involved practical politics and military facts and diplomacy and all these other things. But intellectually, my own opinion is that these people's education influenced them, and if you look for it, you see that. And there's a whole bunch of very serious problems in the founding, of which the one I just told you are the most serious. What happened to Madison running the Constitutional Convention? He's running the whole thing for 6 weeks. Everybody's voting with him. He's, I could give some parallels from conventions where one side seems to win the early votes and then don't, but I don't want to bring up contemporary history, right? I want to bring these things up. Then all of a sudden he's losing every vote, point after point after point. Nowadays we present this as the great compromises that made our Constitution, but and I think that's a legitimate interpretation, but it didn't feel that way to Madison. He felt like he lost control. And Rakov, who's a strong Madisonian, and who boasted to me that he'd never read Cicero's De Officiis, didn't waste his time on that kind of stuff, which was irrelevant to the founding. He is, I think, the most clearly and correctly baffled, because they can't accept the fact that someone that Madison hated and despised, Luther Martin, showed up in the middle, said, what is going on here, stopped everything, and for 2 days ran them over the lessons of classical republicanism. And naturally, Madison was extremely bored at this. This was the last thing he wanted to hear people go over. And after that date, that's when Madison lost control. Best explanation, in my opinion, is, which is almost unthinkable, is that once they were reminded what they thought, they ceased to go along with it. And we know that almost all the objections that Jefferson had to what was going on were, in fact, we know, Madison's ideas. So I think there are a couple of good books on Jefferson as a Enlightenment philosopher. The great multi-volume Life of him by Dumas Malone presents this from the beginning as unquestioned. And all these quotes that I've given you, and I could give you really a dozen more, of Jefferson as a traditionalist. Common law traditionalist, German traditionalist, classical traditionalist.
Not in his theology, certainly.
Not in his theology, although in his political theology he was. In his personal theology he was not. But so you keep bringing up all these personal problems with our heroes here. And I wasn't going to mention this, but I had a very good, one of the great founding people in our movement, not the Lutheran one particularly, but outside of it. And I was involved with a group that included somebody who wrote me an email saying, you can't work with this person on Latin anymore because he believes in the freedom of the will. He's denied the bondage of the will. He's a Pelagian. And I didn't know what to say exactly because what I wanted to do was build up a coalition for Latin, And it may have been wrong of me to collaborate with a Pelagian on this issue there, and on, but almost it's the temptation of being really smart. And Isaac Newton certainly fell for it, and Thomas Jefferson did. There were things where they thought they were smarter than tradition. But for the most part, they did not. Jefferson really remains very loyal to tradition in his politics, in his classical taste, in his interpretation of the common law, which he sees as in the light of the traditionalism of Edmund Coke, not the more rationalizing 18th century visions. The one issue was, of course, that he thought he was being a traditionalist when he went and cut out all the red letter parts of the New Testament and pasted them in. So he wasn't going to follow the later interpretations of the early church. How often we've heard that from our critical friends. He was going to stick to the words of Jesus. Now, it never occurred to him, what it occurs to most traditionalists, that the words of Jesus have the same status as the context. If you're going to, not count the context, you start questioning the words. But still, even when Jefferson did that, which was the thing that I think Christians find most objectionable, he did so out of a commitment to tradition, not out of an idea that he was a rationalist who knew more, but that the words of Jesus were the real tradition.
Well, he had the miracles out of the New Testament.
Yes, that's narrative. Yes, he believed in the sayings of Jesus. He did not include any of the non-red letter parts. Yes, that's by the way absolutely true. And by the way, his classical Christian education didn't include Bible reading till high school. He didn't want children confused. Of course, you cut out David and Goliath and all these fun stories. I don't know what boys would read the Bible if we didn't give them David and Goliath, right? I mean, that's a terrible idea, typical problem with the rationalism. And Jefferson wasn't the only guy. I mean, most of the founders were Christians. Mel Bradford and a number of other people have gone over the signers of the Declaration and the signers of the Constitution. They're massively Christian. Their wills perpetually include statements that my salvation is based on the blood of our Lord and Savior Jesus Christ and no work of my own. You look at Patrick Henry, you look at all these people, they are continually handing down the Bible and the various religious works in their wills, because books were very hard to get hold of in those days, not like nowadays. And they're handing down these key works, which include the Bible, which include Tacitus, which include Locke and Sidney. And of course, Locke was always interpreted by them as a traditionalist and a Christian, which is what Locke said he was. Again, nowadays we have people interpreting him differently. So I don't deny that the people who want to turn Thomas Jefferson into a French philosopher or a 19th century liberal, and my friend Jim Stoner, I just read you his thing. We all reckon when we read the theoretical paragraph in the Declaration, there's a political scientist, we recognize that it's liberalism. Yeah, maybe after Gettysburg we do, but it's not liberalism, it is Whig traditionalism. And the whole Declaration, which is typically interpreted as a work of 18th century logic. For example, Michael Zucker of Notre Dame, this whole thing is a work of of 18th century logic, in fact, is a work of traditional rhetoric. And part of the reason why we can't understand the Declaration is we keep trying to find this premise, major premise, minor premise, conclusion. And there's no doubt that the last paragraph begins, and therefore. So there's certainly a conclusion there. But nobody can agree on what the major and the minor premises are. There's all this big fight. If you analyze it as a work of ancient rhetoric, like a speech of Cicero, which is clearly what Jefferson was thinking of, by the way, that's the way he was educated, as were the audience he was writing for. So you're talking about a really big fight, and it's one that, in my opinion, when you actually look at the whole context, not an individual founder, but the whole group of them, you see they were, as a group, they had a classical education. As a group, they were Christians. As a group, they knew their Greek and Latin. And that is what makes most sense to me. You also bring up the further point of, what's our part in this, the Lutheran part. And we're not as bad as the Catholics. They have Carol of Carrollton, who basically had to go to Europe to get educated, or the laws of the United States would have had him educated as a Protestant, and who managed to preserve his Catholic faith and also be a Republican, a signer. He was the last of the signers to pass away. Tocqueville actually met him just before he passed away. And I think the Lutheran situation is much better than that. I think the basic principles are consistent with the Reformation principles. And I think that Madison's comment in 1821 was sincere. He wasn't president anymore. He wasn't running for office. He was in his retirement. He was quite frank about what he said. And when a Lutheran wrote to him, St. Matthew's was going to be the first English language Lutheran church in New York. Some of us may think that was a mistake also, but still. And it was potentially a very big thing, and Schaeffer wanted to let Madison know what he was doing. And Madison's response is wonderful. He said, Luther's view of the relationship of church and state is the right one. And it's the one that our system is ultimately based on, with the modifications, of course, that are inevitable as time goes by. Actually, it's more 16th century people who had to modify them because of the political situation than the American founders. So I think that without denying for a second that there's a strong Protestant element in America. America's a Protestant country. The great Samuel Huntington, in his book, Who Are We?, which I included on my handout there. It's not really a history book, but it's one of the great arguments that he said, Tocqueville said, America was the first country that didn't have to become equal because they were born equal. And Huntington responds, I don't know whether that's true or not, he says, but America was the first country that was born Protestant and did not have to become Protestant. And that, I think, is a fantastic statement, and that's true in some negative ways of the word Protestant, but it's also true in some very positive Reformation ways. If you read the wills of the founders, it'll amaze you. These guys it's all about Jesus' death, that nothing we do can earn our salvation, references to Jesus' blood. It's there in will after will after will. Part of the thing that was read at the reading of the will, it wasn't just who's going to get, the property, which half the time turned out to be texts of Tacitus and Locke anyhow, of these large estates, but it also was a very clear statement about the faith of the person who was dying. He wasn't dependent on anything he'd done. These are not Donald Trump's will, as awful as that is to imagine. They say over and over again the clearest fundamentals of catechismal Lutheranism and Protestantism. Please, comment, question.
Well, no, that really helped. I appreciate that. I guess I'm wary of sort of the great man theory of history creeping in, and sort of enlisting again classical education as sort of this thing that, since it preceded the founding of the Great Republic, therefore is completely constant with English liberty and the sort of Whig revival understanding of the Anglo-Saxon tradition of common law. And I just think there's a lot that's being or possibly excluded. And for example, aligning Luther with sort of anachronistically, like Luther would have liked America because we're very Protestant, when Luther was probably a lot more Catholic in the sense that the lot of people make much of classical republicanism being the real traditionalism, and it's all those royalist innovators who, ruined it with their monarchy, and they didn't really. And so, by that token, the American Revolution is, of course, a revolution prevented, not an actual revolution, because we're actually being the most English and the most traditional. I think it's interesting to note how reticent I guess at this time they're mostly pietist Lutherans up in Pennsylvania were actually get involved with the American Revolution on their own terms, with notable exceptions like Muhlenberg. But once the authority had changed, then they were of course loyal to the new United States authority. But they didn't feel that it had quite as much of a stake, because it's always been sort of the hallmark of Lutherans to be a little more Augustinian, and we're pilgrims here. We don't want to be that cozy with the city of man. And I just that's not a bad place to be, but I feel like some Lutherans now would you get these essays and pieces. Mark Knoll had a great one, talking about understanding the Lutherans. They're different. They're weird. They're not like normal Protestants. How do we explain this strange phenomenon? And my opinion is like, well, no, we don't really want it to be. That's okay, thanks. But I feel like we have to be very careful getting. I love my country too, but I'm aware that in being a fan of classical education, it's not necessarily going to vindicate all the other things that I held dear. I remember a time where I thought that being like a complete sort of libertarian capitalist and a conservative Republican and exactly what I thought Christian, gelled completely and harmoniously. And I wonder if we can tell ourselves that kind of story as Lutherans.
Yes, that's a very good point. I don't deny it. The great, for the most part, Lutherans who were German speakers, whether they were down south in Savannah or up in Pennsylvania, were not leaders in the war. There's the great story of Muhlenberg finishing his sermon on Sunday, throwing his robes off, and he's wearing the uniform of the Continental Army. And there's a long passage from Walther's writings where he goes on denouncing this, because of course the true vocation, the pastor's vocation, was more important than the patriot's vocation. And I think we're free to agree with either side. I think Muhlenberg represented a genuine tradition. We tend to play down Philip of Hesse, but he did some useful things for us, and Gustavus Adolphus still has a college named after him, and what would have happened in the 30 Years' War without God using him as an instrument is sort of frightening to think about. So I don't see a reason why we should be ashamed of either of our traditions in that regard, frankly. Yes, Dr. Hine.
It was Henry, though, who was more interested, though, in bringing about some sort of a policy, actually, for churches on the American soil. Because all the European models simply wouldn't go and wouldn't fit. It was his two sons that particularly wanted to identify the implications of what it meant to be here as a citizen of this world, and their involvement first in the war and then as statesman. But Henry really was not that involved himself. He was more interested in trying to develop a polity and a liturgy, so we call him the father of American Lutheranism, who happens to have died, I think, within a month of the signing of the Constitution.
Right. The whole family, though, did participate. There are Muhlenbergs who were important figures in the early electoral system, too. Right. But you're right. You're absolutely right. Yeah, a very good book on the Protestant role, in addition to Huntington's, is Barry Shane's book on the myth of American individualism, which came out of Princeton in 1994, the same year that Carl Richard's Founders and the Classics came out of Harvard. And he's very good in arguing for congregationalism as the fundamental shaping institution. And certainly I think, Walther Lutherans can feel that at least they're not outside of that. We're not capital C Congregationalists, but and I know everybody isn't a Waltherian too, obviously, but the idea that the congregation is fundamental as a fundamental building block, and it also works in with a lot of contemporary so-called paleo-conservatism that argues for family and community. Now, what these so-called paleos do when they convert to the Church of Rome, when I try to ask them, they just get angry and say that I can't control my religious desires and trying to impose themselves on it. But I'm just asking. America, Congregationalism has been fundamental, and Shane argues this very convincingly from the beginning, and it's much more of a shaping issue, and that individualism really is the development of the early republic. It's not an important issue in the founding generation to the founders. And here the religious becomes very important. Comment?
Well, it actually be apply anyway, I guess. It bothers me that the classical movement, per se, not so much as the neoconservative movement, embraces the founding fathers as some type of demagogues and demagogues, not demagogues, and that the whole process of our revolution was biblical in orientation. It wasn't. I mean, I feel that there were some, they were all Christian, but it was primarily economics. I mean, if you wanted to get down to the nuts and bolts of it, Sam Adams and John Adams weren't much better than Joseph Kennedy. I mean, as far as the English were concerned. It was about economics, and what, 30% of the people supported the revolution? I think if we have a founding father that people want to grasp, it should be John Dickinson, who vehemently opposed the revolution, but 11 years later was actively involved in the Constitutional Convention. I mean, these guys were men. They weren't any kind of special aristocrats. They were aristocrats. They were the classically trained men of their era,
yes.
And their original document reflects that, because most common people with a servile education, as we've heard here this week, could not vote. I mean, if you look around this room, there's about 7 or 8 of us who can vote. The rest of you can't, because you have to be free, white, 25, male landholders to vote. That's what came out of the Constitutional Convention. And thankfully it's a living document, so now it includes everybody. But those guys represented their class, not America, when they came out. They didn't represent all Americans. They were a cut above, and so they would serve and lead everyone else that couldn't vote. That would be my premise, because it does annoy me greatly when I hear people preach that they were all encompassing, they were all things to all people. I mean, Simon Rutledge was all things to all people. He was going to cancel the whole Declaration if he didn't get to keep slavery. I mean, it's commerce,
Well, yeah, I would certainly, a world in which we took John Dickinson more seriously would be great, but Dickinson did defend the rights of the colonists. He did refuse to sign the Declaration. He did sign he was the author of the Articles of Confederation.
And he was in the Continental Army, even though he refused to sign the Declaration.
Yes. And of course, there's my favorite Quaker, Nathaniel Greene, the great general, who managed to defeat Cornwallis by losing every single battle, but making sure that Cornwallis lost more men than he did. And it's the one great. Yes, there's a Quaker I can really admire and look up to. There's certainly Ho Chi Minh. I'm a little bit softer on there. I'm not so big on him. But I must say the fact that our founders are a rich and diverse group, the things that unite them are also significant, and their classical education united the overwhelming number of them. And economics was certainly a factor, but you see, if you read Washington very carefully, although he didn't have a classical education, he'd been well instructed by Colonel Mason into the principles. And he's very clear that we act on principle, but we can't expect people to give up their advantage. And of course, the work that they knew the best from the classical philosophy was Cicero's De Officiis, with the whole question of right and advantage, and when they can conflict and when they don't truly conflict, is discussed very carefully by Cicero. Cicero also discusses very clearly how important property is, and how it's a part of being a real citizen. And it isn't from Locke they learned this. They learned it from Cicero in their schools. And it's our contemporary historians who won't read these books. As I said, one of the most distinguished, learned, and brilliant of our contemporary historians, Pulitzer Prize winner Jack Rakove, was quite, he has other better things to do than read Cicero, because he's convinced that he understands these guys. They're hard-nosed, Tip O'Neill type politicians, and that is not false either. It's just as it's not the whole story, and what we're trying to do is get the whole, our part of the story put into the mix.
But the monarchists, when they wanted to become monarchists, even though they were classically trained, who did they pick? The roughshod George Washington.
Yes, they turned to Washington.
He was the king of America. And he was not classically trained, as you said.
He was not classically educated, but he was well instructed. I mean, this is a complicated issue. Gary Wills has a wonderful book on Washington and Cincinnatus, and it's well worth looking at because Wills, who had a PhD in classics from Yale and sort of spent his summers working at Douglas Southwell Freeman's newspaper in Richmond, knew Southwell Freeman's great life of Washington well, and still the greatest life of Washington, though we now know things he didn't. And he shows that Washington was very strongly influenced by the ideals of the classics, although he himself didn't have a classical education. And Jefferson and Adams were always kidding about this to one another. Oh, George is wonderful. Didn't have a real education. He's wonderful. But he was wonderful. He was wonderful. And his own ideal was that of Cincinnatus. And Wills makes this point wonderfully, that he's perpetually resigning. Because this is what Cincinnatus does. Cincinnatus wins the battle, then he goes back. And that's why when these guys tried to make him king, this was an absolute, which by the way was the smart move. He was the smart guy. He was the guy who could unite us. But his principle, it wasn't money, it was his principles that kept him from accepting that.
Yeah,
he declined. It was so the great moments in American history is Washington reading his refusal to accept the offer from the army. And he puts his glasses on, and as he does, he looks at it and says, "I've become gray and also blind, almost blind in the service of my country." Then he read the document. At the end, all these brave soldiers are weeping. It's uncontrollable sobbing, because they had tempted him to do what was wrong, and he had refused to. And it's one of the great moments in American history. It's not a financial one, it is a moral. It's a moral moment.
Thank you, Dr. Kopff.
Thank you for your attention.